Welcome to the Lad Chat Podcast.
Welcome to the Lad Chat Podcast. Today is a special with me, Chris, and our special guest, Andy Thomas. Really excited to get Andy on. Andy's the creator of the Truth Agenda.org, author of 9 books. The Truth Agenda Conspiracies, which I actually own, but I embarrassingly admitted to Andy I've lost it. An introduction into crop circles, and a really intriguing book called Christmas. What's that about, Andy? Christmas,
well, I mean, it's what's my interest in things like conspiracies. My other sort of trail of interest is about history and folklore. And you'll often find there's much more buried in there than you think. And Christmas is something I've always rather liked. And I know some people have got rather anti-Christmas because of all the commercialisation, of course. But I think there's more to it. And when you look back into the deep background, it's very esoteric. You've got a lot of very ancient stuff in there. You've got astrology. And when you look at the story of Christmas and how it's changed over the years, and that date around the winter solstice has been used to mark the birth of so many gods, and so many other festivals have grown around it. It's a really fascinating story to tell. So I've been giving lectures about Christmas for a while and looking at that, and so I put it into a book last year, and next year that book will be going worldwide, in fact, into several different languages. So again, it's something that's easy to take it for granted, but when you actually look at the detail, you realise there's so much more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really so I sort of got to see your work on YouTube, and I was really interested watching one of your lectures, A Conspiracy History of the World speech. Absolutely fascinating. And some of the topics that you covered, the moon landing is one of a massive interest of mine. And we've done a few podcasts on it, actually. What do you think about the? I'm just interested to get your views on the moon landings, or the fake moon landings I keep hearing. What do you think, Andy? Do we go?
Yeah, well, listen, I think that the moon landings story is, of course, one of those things which we hold up in our society as one of our major achievements.
Yeah.
And, mankind, we do bad things, we have wars, terrible things, but also, look, hey, we can go to the moon. So it's had a great value to the world in making us feel better about ourselves. But, quite early on, even at the time of the moon landing, some people were not sure really that they were happening. People thought they saw strange things in some of the footage, and it was quite quickly that people wondered, did we really go? But as the years have gone by, and of course now we have computer analysis techniques available on everybody's laptop, people are starting to look at that evidence and thinking, well, some of this doesn't look like it's on the moon. And now, in my mind, there is no doubt at all that at least some of those images are fake. Are all of them fake? Could well be. But if they are, you, of course, have to ask why.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Was it that the pictures didn't come out because of the radiation on the moon? Was it that they actually couldn't show what it was they found there once they got there? Or did they really not go? Was it that they just were not able to achieve it, and, they had to show the world something? So then, in that scenario, they had to fake the whole thing in the studio. And the answer is, we are not sure for certain. But what we can say, I think, pretty much for certain, is that the evidence that is presented that we went to the moon doesn't hold up. And, of course, then you're going to get conspiracy theories because people want to know why we're not being told the truth. And that's why that is one that rumbles on. And, of course, next year is the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing, and we're going to hear a lot about the official story. But I don't think it's going to make people change their minds for the people that challenge the evidence, because there are too many holes in a lot of it. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that gets discussed next year.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because you think either way, it's an amazing story. We're either absolutely everyone's being lied to, or we've sent someone to the moon. It's incredible. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite right, either way. Now, I mean, NASA will say, well, look, we've got orbital pictures showing you dots and lines on the moon where you can see where the landers went down. To which the answer is, well, yes, but you can do anything with Photoshop these days. Or B, if they are there, that still doesn't prove that the pictures that we see taken allegedly on the lunar surface are actually really taken there. And until the day a new probe lands right near these sites and they photograph the same things, all left exactly where they were left in the 1970s, we're not going to settle it until we see the same lighting conditions, everything there, in exactly the same spot. I'm afraid the argument's going to rumble on. So, it's a big one, though, because if you do say that they've lied about something as big as the moon landings, of course it opens the door to think, well, what else have they lied about?
Yeah.
And for many people, it's quite shocking when you show them some of the anomalies around the moon landings. They realise, actually, maybe some of the biggest things in the world have been misrepresented to me. And that's when they'll often go on a whole journey of inquiry. So it's an important one to use to show people that certainly whatever you think, whether we did or didn't go to the moon, we never told the whole story. And that is, of course, the whole bedrock of conspiracy theories.
You would think, though, in my cynical mind, or maybe actually, to get all that effort to go to the moon and then just stop. It just seems a bit non-commonsensical, doesn't it? I understand, things have changed, and, I know there's a lot of pressure on the American governments to stop spending money on going to the moon because no one else was bothered or no one else could. But you would think, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that NASA gave only in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years as to why they haven't been back and why they're struggling to get new missions to go back now is that they can't actually work out how to do it. Now, that is a very mysterious thing. That it seemed to be very easy to do it with old tin boxes in the late 60s and early 70s. And mysteriously now, they say they're still trying to find ways that they can get men to the moon and back in one piece. So this is an oddity. They, at one point, were claiming they'd lost all the original blueprints for what they did in the 60s, which seems almost unbelievable for the most historic thing that ever happened.
I don't know, I work with a few idiots.
You do have to ask, why have we not been back in all this time? And one presumes it is indeed because actually it's more difficult to go than anybody was letting on back with the Apollo missions.
Have you read a book, Who Built the Moon? Is it Andy Butler that wrote it? And what he suggests is actually it's an alien base, and the reason why no one's gone back to the moon is because it's inhabited by aliens, and actually they were just warned to bugger off.
Well, I mean, this is a theory that you hear quite often, is that in fact their already presence is up on the moon, and that we couldn't show what we really found. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind some of the astronauts are on record as saying that they witnessed UFO activity. And Edgar Mitchell was one such astronaut, and he died just a year or so ago. So it is certainly possible that they discovered things out there that they weren't able to share. So maybe that is another reason why, they had to stage photographs somewhere safely that wasn't going to show the world what was going on. But, I mean, knowing the whole truth, that is very difficult. I mean, we don't absolutely know, of course, but there's certainly a lot of people think there are structures up there and on Mars, and, if you go back to the Alternative 3 theories, which was a conspiracy theory in the 1970s based on a television program which purported to be fiction, but some people believe that it wasn't. If that's true, then in fact we've already got official bases up on the moon and on Mars, and they've been running for years, and they haven't told us. So that's a whole other spin, is that maybe it's not alien activity they don't want to show us, it's our own activity they don't want to show us. Well, but it's only a theory, of course.
But there was an interview with Buzz Aldrin, and someone was asking him why they hadn't gone back to the moon, and within the interview, he said that Neil Armstrong had gone back to, he said Mars, actually, and lots of people picked up and said, actually, that they've been further to the moon than they've been to Mars, and there's actually a human base there. It'd be fascinating, wouldn't it?
I mean, I'm not aware that Buzz Aldrin himself said that. If he did, well, that's, of course, very interesting. But, I mean, it's certainly something that a lot of people do believe.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I know there was a lot of people that were quite critical, wasn't it, of the NASA space program, and actually didn't think that it was going to get as far as it would. And quite a few of the astronauts, the original astronauts that were meant to be going to the moon, didn't they die in some unexplained sort of like burning bonfire incident?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to there is the astronaut Gus Grissom, or Virgil Grissom, to give his full name. He was very critical of the Apollo missions. He should have been the first man on the moon, and he was being groomed to, lead that first mission. But he was not convinced that the technology was going to get them there and he started to say this very loudly at press conferences, and he started to make enemies within NASA, and he started to get death threats, and he believed this was coming from within NASA. And indeed, one week, he said to his wife, if there is ever an accident, inverted commas, in the NASA space program, it's likely to be me. And then within a short time of him saying that, he and the other two members of the Apollo 1 crew died on the launch pad fire. It was just a test. They weren't going anywhere, but they had a very ill-advisedly oxygen-rich atmosphere, and that's very prone to catching fire, and they were incinerated. And, of course, it was promoted as a terrible accident. But the Griffin family have long said they believe it was sabotage, that their father, or husband was murdered. And Thomas Ronald Barron, who was the NASA safety inspector brought in to investigate the fire, he also concluded that it was sabotage. And he also started to look at the whole technical feasibility of the Apollo program in general, and wrote a very critical 30-page report, which more or less implied they were not ready to go to the moon. But then shortly after having published that, he dies in a mysterious car crash. So some people think, well, what with two people now having died strange deaths who've been critical of the Apollo missions, well, maybe anybody else would stay quiet. This is not to say that the whole of NASA would be in on this. Absolutely not. Most people working for NASA believe they went to the moon. And people in mission control probably believe that those signals did come from the moon. But did they? And that's the thing. Maybe they were all fooled as well. But it's going to rumble on, I'm afraid. I think until we get absolute evidence, as to whether we did or didn't go, I'm afraid these arguments are going to go for a long time.
Yeah. Isn't there a Chinese rover on the moon at the moment? And didn't they say they were only going to present? Is it 7 or 8 pictures?
Well, a Chinese rover got to the moon, I think, a year or two back, and it didn't last long. It went offline very quickly, which some people thought was interesting, and some people claim NASA had zapped it so that they couldn't, investigate. I believe the Chinese are intending to go back, so it'll be very interesting. And of course, you've got people like Elon Musk talking about manning, missions across the solar system. If you start getting independent expeditions to the moon, then I think we will start to see whether or not the NASA story was true, because, these independent missions, they would have no reason to cover for NASA. So it's going to be interesting to see if that happens.
There's a really good book. It's called The Day After Roswell. Have you read that book?
I am very aware of that book, yes.
And so the author talks about there being moon bases, doesn't he? What do you think of that? Do you think that...
Well, it comes back to what we were saying earlier, is that, yes, some people believe that we have put bases up there. Others believe there are alien bases up there. But again, this is the issue with all of this. Unless you see absolute 100% evidence with your own eyes, it's hard to be sure. I think we have to be open-minded to all of these ideas, because some things that have, been seen as a bit wacky have turned out to be true. So we have to keep open minds and keep looking for that evidence and keep conversations going in the hope that one day we will find out one way or the other.
It's I could talk about the moon, but the editor's telling me to crack on now, because I could spend all day talking about this. In terms that, so another really fascinating story, which actually I didn't hear of until I saw your speech, was about the US Liberty incident. The USS is
well, indeed so. That's an interesting one, because people listening may well be aware of the false flag attack, which is where you basically you launch an attack, but you make it look like the enemy did it, or you make it look like somebody else did it, but it helps you justify all the mandates for war and whatever else it is that you want. And something that's often held up as being a kind of a false flag attack is in the 6-Day War, when Israel was basically in conflict with most of the people on its different borders. And during the war in 1967, a very strange thing happened, because there was an American ship that was just there monitoring signals. It wasn't a warship as such. It was just monitoring the signals of what was going on. And, of course, the Americans and the Israelis are generally allies. Mysteriously, the ship was attacked. and it was attacked by clearly Israeli forces. And although the ship did survive, men died, and it was very badly damaged. And later on, the Israelis said it had been a big mistake. They had thought that it was an enemy ship. And yet, many people on board the USS Liberty said it was absolutely clear to anybody that they were a US ship, that they were flying the US flag. There are also claims that signals were made, and that everybody knew well that that was an American ship. So why would the Israelis attack it and then basically say it was all a big mistake? And this is something that's been rumbling on for years. There is a campaign from some of the survivors of the USS Liberty. It's been running for years to try to get a new investigation. And the general belief is that this ship perhaps was hearing a little bit too much. The Israelis didn't want to give away their strategy too quickly. And when they realized the Americans were listening in, it's almost as if they thought, you know what, the best thing to do here is to just take that ship out. But there's yet another theory, which is that the theory says that maybe by sinking the ship, had it sunk, and of course it didn't in the end, but it was badly damaged, had it sunk, maybe they were, or somebody was hoping to trigger a wider conflict, because an American ship going down, obviously that's very bad news. In the event, I think that it didn't work out as planned. It wasn't sunk. Some believe that the Israeli forces that were attacking it could see very well that it was a US ship. And therefore were not quite so keen to create the maximum devastation they could have done. And although the boat was torpedoed, it's almost as if they were aiming to miss. So it's strange. It's almost like the Israelis felt very uncomfortable about being ordered to attack a US ship. And so because it didn't sink, suddenly it was all very embarrassing. So the US and the Israelis, they basically covered it up and said, sorry, it was all a terrible mistake, and we accept it was a mistake. And the world moved on. But some people think to this day, it was an attempt basically to inflate the war further and create more international tensions around it. So, it's a very interesting story, because you don't generally hear of this kind of thing going on, of allies attacking each other. But, this kind of thing does happen throughout history.
And then there's an interesting sort of conspiracy, wasn't there, about sort of how America got involved in the war, and sort of ships being sunk possibly by allies to get America into the war, or ships being allowed to be sunk by allies to get America into the war.
Sure. I mean, there's a number of wars where, you certainly get accusations of this. In World War I, you get the famous story of the Lusitania, and that was one of our ships, and it shuttled back and forth across the Atlantic, and would often have Americans on board. But it was sunk one day in 1915. And at this stage, America was not in the war, and of course, a lot of American people were on board and were lost. And the reason it sunk is something that's been argued about for years. There were U-boats, of course, in the Atlantic. But whenever the Lusitania came into British waters, it was nearly always escorted safely into harbour by, British warships that would protect it from the U-boats. But mysteriously, one day, just as it was coming sort of under Southern Ireland, the British warships just suddenly left it on its own. They went away, they gave no signal, no explanation, and so Lusitania was left vulnerable, and down it went, with over 1,200 people dying. Many people have thought, was that ship deliberately left vulnerable? Because knowing that if that ship went down and a lot of Americans were lost, of course it might help bring America into the war, which it did. Now, not immediately, but it was certainly a factor that would in the end bring America into the war. But interestingly, of course, that conspiracy theory goes a little bit deeper, because people have wondered, well, who gave the order to leave the ship vulnerable? Was it the First Lord of the Admiralty? Well, the First Lord of the Admiralty back then was Winston Churchill. And he did write a letter to an aide shortly before Lusitania went down, effectively implying that we needed a ship to go down because it would help bring America into the war. And that exact scenario is what happened. So was Churchill involved with engineering that? And some people do believe so. So, I mean, he's a great hero to many, of course, but some people think he was rather ruthless and would do what he saw as necessary. And you get a lot of stories like this in many wars, but that is a famous one.
It's interesting as well because there's a lot of conspiracies about Pearl Harbor, the attacks on Pearl Harbor as well, and about maybe people sleeping on the job, doing an old Winston Churchill.
Well, that's right. I mean, the Pearl Harbor bombing is another maritime disaster that again brings America into the war, and it's always promoted as a surprise attack by the Japanese. But when you look more deeply into it, I mean, the Japanese were being provoked by the Americans. Franklin Roosevelt wanted America, to join the war at this stage, but many Americans were keen to stay out. They had a lot of business interests in Germany at that stage. And it is clear that intelligence reports were received which said exactly where and when that attack would take place, but they were ignored. And you'll find that even at the time, you get top U.S. Navy brass, people like Vice Admiral Libby, who's on record as saying, I would go to my grave convinced that Roosevelt knew and he let it happen. And you will find other statements from other Navy people. So, again, it looks like somebody knew that they needed to have a reason to bring America into the war. And, of course, Pearl Harbor, by letting it happen, was the perfect opportunity. And then, of course, then they were at war with Japan and then by default Germany. So, yes, sadly, this kind of thing goes on a lot.
It's unbelievable to think, isn't it? But I suppose you can see the benefit of getting America into the war. It's a massive superpower, and actually you want them on your side, don't you?
Well, this is the counter-argument, which is, it's war. You have to do ruthless things in war sometimes. But obviously many people feel very deeply uncomfortable. It's just worth a brief mention here also of how the Vietnam War began.
Yeah.
Because we're often told that began with the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is where we're told that the U.S. naval fleet was attacked by the North Vietnamese communist fleet. But actually, although this was the very event that we are told triggered the war, the reality is that all that occurred was a minor gunboat skirmish, which was very common in those waters. And in fact, what happened was one night a very heavy fog came down. The US Navy thought they saw blips on their sonar indicating an imminent attack, and they opened fire into the fog, but they quickly realized, in fact, there was nobody coming towards them. It was sonar error. You can get that in certain weather conditions. However, instead of actually telling the world that actually nothing really happened, instead, Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, he made a big speech saying, we've been attacked, we must go to war. And Lyndon Johnson, who's often the target of many conspiracy theories, also gave a big speech the next day, again saying there was an attack. And yet some years later it was admitted quietly, well, it wasn't, or not really, and sorry, it was all a big mistake, but there we go. But of course, for that mistake, many hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, terrible suffering resulted, but again, it looks like America was just waiting for a reason, and that was good enough. So they didn't even need to trigger a false flag attack, they just said there'd been an attack. And this is the way history goes, I'm afraid.
They like using their ships as well, don't they? Is it? Do you think there's a theme there going, a maritime theme?
Well, listen, when you've got ships manoeuvring around the world, of course, you've always got risky business because you're going over boundaries that are not land-based, and it's very easy to trigger an incident that way. And, of course, in war, shipping is vulnerable. So it's quite an easy thing to set up, really. It's much easier than setting something up on land.
Well, there's not many people going to see it, is there, happening?
And that is the other thing. Well, exactly right. And if you go back to the USS Liberty event, of course, one of the problems is the only people that remember this happening are the people on board the ship and the people doing the attacking. Well, the people who are doing the attacking are obviously going to keep quiet. And the people on board the ship were not treated well. They were not treated as heroes. They were an embarrassment. And, that's why they've been mounting campaigns to get their side of the story heard. But you're absolutely right. If you're not there, you don't know what's happening. And the same with the Gulf of Tonkin attack. If you say there was an attack, well, unless you were on those ships, and they were probably all ordered just to go with it and shut up. You don't know.
No.
Because it's all far away from most people's eyes. So, yes, indeed, that is why.
It's interesting though, isn't it? So these attacks, were they submarine attacks? The ISS Liberty, because I'm just thinking, why didn't they piss and shoot back?
Well, the Liberty was strafed with fire from aeroplanes,
Right.
And it was torpedoed by torpedo boats.
Right, okay.
So, I mean, this is another issue, because the torpedo boats, this is not like a flash attack. They were near enough to see what they were firing on.
Yeah, of course.
And the thought that they could not see that it was a US ship is really pretty unbelievable.
Yeah.
And something else as well about that attack is that the Israelis jammed the radio frequencies of the Liberty just before they open fire. Now, that's a tactic. So if you jam the radio frequencies, of course, the ship is more vulnerable. However, you could only jam radio frequencies if you've been listening into those radio signals in the first place.
Yeah.
And had they been doing that, well, of course, they would have known it was a US ship.
Yeah.
So their claim that they didn't know really does not stand up. And it's a very strange business, which I think we do still need to know a lot more about. But plainly, there was skullduggery going on there. And, they've tried to cover it up as much as possible ever since.
It's a dangerous tactic messing with those Americans. They're bloody nuts.
Well, indeed, yes.
So another conspiracy which I absolutely find fascinating, and I'm still, when I think about, the more I think about, the more dodgy it sounds, is the Princess Diana conspiracy, and the conspiracy being that actually there's a bit more to it than a simple car crash. Although it seems a very popular way of getting rid of someone, doesn't it?
I mean, if you look at what most British people believe about Princess Diana, even though the inquest said it was all an accident caused by a drunk driver and the paparazzi chased the car and he lost control, that is not what the majority of people believe. I mean, most polls say that most British people, I mean, some polls give around 90%, but, it's a lot of people believe she was murdered.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think the problem is when you look at the detail of what occurred, the official story doesn't hang together.
Yeah.
And this is usually where you get conspiracy theories. And it's funny, when I wasn't sure how I stood on this until I had to research the Diana story for my book, Conspiracies. I mean, I've covered it a little bit in the Truth Agenda book, but I had to really go into some detail in the Conspiracies book. Then I certainly came out of it realising, they're lying here. What the exact truth is another matter. But, I mean, you've got issues like the fact that the driver, who we are told was so drunk that he lost control, there is no CCTV on the night showing him drunk. No witnesses said he was drunk. He was a professional driver. Why would he be drunk? And the blood sample that we are told proved that it was later admitted had been switched with somebody else's sample.
See, that's dodgy.
And then they said, yes, but we did other tests and he definitely was drunk. However, if you believe the toxicology reports that they cite, he should have been so drunk, he shouldn't have been able to have even got out of bed that night.
And you would have
there's
thought,
a lot
would
of
you?
strangeness about that. Also, shortly before the inquest blamed him, this man called Henri Paul. Henri Paul's family had been told only a few days before that he would not be held responsible. He was going to be exonerated. But it's like they were toying with coming up with another explanation, and then they realised it was just easier to blame him.
Yeah.
And 3 days later, the inquest just put it all on him. But you've also got claims of the strange white Fiat.
That's
seen,
right.
well, not seen there, but they have the paint on the Mercedes, so we know it struck, or the other way around, a white Fiat at some point during the accident in the underpass. There were reports of a mysterious white flash.
I was going to say that.
No, I mean, some people say, did somebody flash something into the eyes of Henri Paul so he lost control? But you'd think, wouldn't you, we would want to really know who owned that Fiat so we could find out what happened. But mysteriously, all the CCTV in that quarter of Paris was off that night.
Wow.
So, funnily enough, the French authorities say they weren't able to trace it. But Mohammed El-Fayed, whose son Dodi had also just died in this crash. So, he had a right to want to know more about what was going on here. He hired private detectives, and they quickly tracked down a man called James N. Benson, who did own a white Fiat. Now, he said it wasn't him, he said he wasn't there. The strange it was that just a short while after being exposed, he was found dead in another car, and he'd been shot in the head and decapitated. The car had been locked from the outside and set fire to, and the French authorities said this was suicide.
It makes me laugh, that is.
So this is what we're dealing with here, and, nobody seemed to think that was strange. So it does seem odd that Danson was then quickly bumped off. So is that coincidence, or were they shutting him up? But then you've got the Diana letters. She wrote to Paul Burrell, her butler. She wrote, or said, I think, verbally to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon, there is a plot to kill me. The letters are publicly available, and she absolutely says they're going to get rid of me. And she believed Prince Charles wanted to marry Tiggy Leg Bourke, not Camilla. And Tiggy Leg Bourke was the nanny to William and Harry, and there were all kinds of claims. Diana believed Charles was having an affair with him. So it's all very mysterious. Camilla had a car crash shortly before Diana did, which nobody remembers. That's been almost written out of history.
Yeah.
And at the time it was reported, she said that she thought somebody might be trying to kill her because she got run off the side of the road in the country lanes near her house. Was it that somebody was trying to get rid of just anybody out of this horrible quadrangle between Charles, Camilla, Tiggy and Diana? And then having failed with Camilla, they thought, okay, we better try somebody else this time. I know, let's get rid of Diana.
Gosh,
don't forget, Diana was making a lot of enemies. She was campaigning very successfully against landmines. Yeah. And yet she's going out with Dodi Al-Fayed, whose mother is Samira Khashoggi of the Khashoggi Arms Dealing Company. I mean, maybe they didn't want a peacenik at the dinner table. Was she pregnant? Was it that somebody didn't want a Muslim bloodline coming into the royal family? All of this has been discussed and will be for a long time. But what you can say is that when you stand back and look at all the evidence, it doesn't hang together that it was just an accident. And she certainly had enemies queuing up to get rid of her, that is for sure.
It's crazy, isn't it? You know how many people, when these investigations go on, start going missing. There was a case about 7 or 8 years ago now. It's a Gareth Williams. Can you remember the Welsh spy found in his bathtub, inside the bag? Yeah. It was suicide, wasn't it? How the hell did that happen?
He managed to zip himself into a very small, tight bag, didn't he, or something?
Yeah.
Well, listen, mysterious deaths, I mean, they're always going to lead to conspiracy theories. And I mean, the other one, of course, is Dr. David Kelly.
That's right, yeah.
And it's very similar to Diana. You get a similar poll response when you ask people whether they thought he did commit suicide, as we're told, or whether he was murdered. Well, most people believe he was murdered. And I mean, for anybody that doesn't remember, he, of course, was the UN weapons inspector that, in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, spoke to the BBC and said there are no weapons of mass destruction. This is a scam. And, of course, that upset the Blair administration, and they released his name to the press. And he was then publicly embarrassed and hauled before parliamentary committees, and then shortly afterwards was found dead in the woods near his home, which we were told was suicide. And yet, I mean, even MPs, like then MP Norman Baker, wrote a book saying Kelly was murdered. It's obvious he was murdered. Very little blood loss, very little drug in his system. His body was provably moved from where it was originally found to where the police then photographed it, dressed more to look like a suicide with a knife on his chest. Yeah. There are so many things that don't make sense. And yet, when Lord Hutton was brought in to investigate this, the Hutton inquiry was meant to decide once and for all how Kelly really died. He just concluded it was suicide without ever producing the medical reports to prove it. And when challenged about this, they said, in fact, they're going to now put a block on those records. So I think we've still got, 60, 65 years to go before we ever see them. But just last year, when a new campaign was saying, look, we really need to look into this, maybe we ought to do a new autopsy on the remains of Kelly, their response was to dig up David Kelly and cremate him.
Wow. See, this is high-level corruption.
What does that tell you? Because it looks to many like they really don't want anybody to get close to the real evidence. And now we'll never know. So that was very clever of them. But then they wonder why they get conspiracy theories. Well, it's pretty obvious why, really.
And this is not only conspiracy, this is high level corruption, isn't it? Corruption at the absolute highest level where, it might, going back to the Diana story when they talk about this driver being so drunk that he was off the scale. But, I mean, people would have noticed him being that drunk. people around him. Diana, surely she's got bodyguards. There's people in the bar. If you're the driver of probably arguably the most famous woman in the world, people would notice if you were getting in the bar getting absolutely hammered, wouldn't they?
You would, and you might then think, actually, you might want to point that out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, nobody has said that. I mean, absolutely nobody. But there's another interesting little tale, which, it is claimed that on the night of the crash, when Diana was retrieved, she was badly injured, but she was taken to a hospital in Paris. And there is testimony of the French doctors who say that they had her comfortable. They thought she was probably going to survive. But the story goes that the English doctors then showed up, escorted the French doctors out of the room and said, "We'll carry on here, thanks very much." And then she was dead shortly after. And it is said that one of these French doctors was going to write a book about what he witnessed that night before he then died in a mysterious car crash. So, you got all of this surrounding it, all these claims and counterclaims. And I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of it, but I think we can say there are many very suspicious elements around the death of Diana. And that's why I think in most people's gut, they just know there's something wrong with the story.
And it just... that seems quite similar as well to the JFK incident. So after he was shot, is it true that sort of FBI agents came in and took his remains?
Well, listen, I mean, obviously, the Kennedy conspiracies, they are the classic ones that people hold up as the perfect example of how one conspiracy theory leads to another. Yeah. And in my view, rightly so, because there are so many unanswered questions. I mean, first of all, how many people were firing bullets? Not many people believe it was only one person, but if you say there were more people, which the ballistics reports seem to suggest, well, then it's a wider coup d'etat. It isn't just one fanatic. But then, yes, you have claims of things like the body was tampered with. Some say they even switched the body. Who knows? But the gun, I mean, for instance, the gun that we are told that Oswald fired, so Oswald was, the one blamed for it, it was not then the gun that was exhibited later on. So it's like even the basics of the physical evidence, the forensic evidence, seems to have been destroyed or switched or changed. Plainly, people just didn't want anybody getting near the truth. And this still rumbles on today. I mean, there are so many threats to the Kennedy conspiracy theories. But I think it's pretty clear when you look at the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was then shot dead himself by a man called Jack Ruby, who then himself started to say to people, look, there's a wider thing going on here, and I'm going to tell you all about it. And then he dies in the police cells before he ever gets to tell the full story. It's going to make you suspicious.
Dead man can't tell.
Bear in mind that there was a lady who worked in Ruby's rather sleazy nightclub, a lady called Rose Shirami. She claimed that on the eve of the shooting of Kennedy, she overheard Oswald and Ruby together, working together in a back room of the club, with men she believed to be CIA.
Right.
And she went to the police that night and said, call off the parade because they're planning to kill the president. Don't let this go ahead. Well, of course, they did. And, of course, after he was shot, she was rather compromised, which might explain why she was then found dead lying by the side of a road shortly afterwards. So, sadly, if you get involved with these things, your life is in danger. And it does look like absolutely nobody wanted any of this to come out.
I was reading an article a few months ago, and it was talking about Marilyn Monroe and her untimely death being associated with having knowledge of the JFK assassination. Have you heard that?
I mean, listen, this is one of the classic claims, isn't it, that Marilyn was a bit of a loose cannon, and actually, she knew much more about the Kennedys. I mean, it is said, I don't know if it's proven, but it is said she had an affair with both John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
Is he good?
So she would have known, them pretty well, but she was also, of course, somebody who had, problems with drugs and drink, and of course could well have come out with stuff. So many people believe her death was in fact murder, but I think that happened before Kennedy actually died.
Yeah.
But she certainly could have told the world a few things about them, I'm sure, and maybe they were worried that she would, having been rejected by both the Kennedys. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mystery surrounding Marilyn's death, and sadly I think she was a bit of a pawn in a wider game.
It's really sad, isn't it? You know. Have you ever seen Jesse Ventura? I'm not that I'm taking this as any put a reference, by the way. Jesse Ventura's Conspiracy Theories. Do you ever watch that show?
I mean, I am aware of it, but do you have something in particular that you think is interesting?
Sorry, it does seem a bit random, but Jesse Ventura, before he was an actor, before he was a wrestler, before he was mad, I guess, he was in the Special Forces. Did you know that? He was a marksman.
I mean, Jesse Ventura. Excuse me, one moment. He's got an interesting background. I mean, he obviously has sort of made a name for himself in the conspiracy world, but some people think that he is perhaps going a little bit far in some areas. So you have to take your pick on that one.
Well, that's it, and I agree. Some of his shows are bloody mad. He is, you know.
Well, I don't think we can ever say that anybody is mad, because we don't know that, but he's got opinions which he shares very loudly. I mean, there are people that absolutely agree with everything he says, but some people think that he could be a little bit more discerning, and maybe, certain things he says then bring down the reputation of the good stuff, because they seem a little bit far-fetched. But on the other hand, there are people that look at everything we're discussing here and think it's all far-fetched. So it's all relative, and I never want to be too quick to condemn somebody because they've got a view that doesn't quite match mine. I mean, what I always say to anybody who's got a conspiracy theory is that if you've got the evidence, please present it, because that's crucial. If you haven't got evidence and it's just hearsay, that's never going to go down well in the wider world. If you make a big claim, you have to really produce the evidence that backs you up on that. But
what I was going to add to that was some of the things I think he says, is quite far-fetched, but a really interesting one was he was a marksman, a very, very highly rated shot, actually, and he tried to replicate the shots for the JFK assassination, and he was saying how much for accomplished marksman he was and things, and he tried to have a go, and he couldn't get anywhere near it. The 3 shots within a few seconds, and he was, as he said, he was very experienced in firearms. He'd used all these guns, top marksman. He had world-class training. It was just really interesting, actually, because he added a bit more credibility to it.
Well, I mean, this is one of the main arguments. I mean, so we're told 3 shots were fired. We're told by the Warren Commission that they were all fired by Oswald. But, I mean, you've got a moving target. You've got to fire a lot of bullets very quickly. And one of those bullets, very famously, and if you see the Kevin Costner movie JFK, they kind of expose how ridiculous this is. One of the bullets has to create an awful lot of damage, which many ballistics experts say isn't possible. And therefore, you have to conclude other people were firing bullets. I should just say here, Channel 5 keeps telling us that the extra bullet was an accident and that it was a security guard's gun going off. But that really doesn't fit with the evidence that others say. The famous grassy knoll is a raised area in Dealey Plaza where the shooting took place. And we have people there who report hearing shots coming from over the wall there, and the police audio recorders, they were on their belts, or dicta belts as they called them, record at least 6 shots. Now, some say no, that's just the sound of a ricochet or whatever, but others say no, they were definitely more than 3 shots. And although the world seems to think that the American state has definitively concluded there was only one gunman, they always forget that in 1979, the US state did reinvestigate because there have been so many criticisms of the Warren Commission. And actually, that report concluded that there was a, quote, high probability that other gunmen were present. Except that they then left that hanging and then never actually revealed who the other people might have been. But that actually is the official view of the American state, is that it was in fact a wider coup d'etat, but they can't be bothered to look any further into it. So I think that tells you something.
It's incredible, you know, because you would think if it was the mafia that killed him, maybe the government. I don't understand why the government would because protect them or the Cubans. You know, you would think if it was the Cubans that had him shot, surely that's ammunition. You'd want everyone to know that, wouldn't you?
Well, probably not, because, I mean, listen, the CIA, of course, have all kinds of dubious connections, and we should remember there are various claims that the mafia and the CIA were all in cahoots with who knows what other influences as well, and you don't upset the mafia quickly.
No,
so if you blame the mafia totally for it, they might then be the ones to say, yeah, well, guess what, the CIA were involved as well.
Yeah.
So nobody would want to expose each other, and that goes for all different factions, of course. So, I mean, no, it wouldn't be in their interest to point the finger, and so it still hangs open today. I mean, most people today generally believe that whether you think it was mafia or Fidel Castro or whatever, it was also very convenient for the New World Order project to get rid of Kennedy because he wasn't playing the game and had not turned out to be as manipulable as some were thinking that he would be. So, I mean, you got that whole other side to it in there as well, of course.
And coming on to the New World Order, what's your thoughts on the New World Order? David Icke talks a lot about the New World Order, doesn't he? And it talks about sort of like, you know, we did a talk actually only a few weeks ago. It was about what were they? There's the modern monoliths, isn't there, in America that they put the Georgia Guidestone. Sorry.
Oh yes, indeed.
What do you think of that?
Well, okay, two things we should say here. So the Georgia Guidestones are a monument which has various carvings on it about how the world ought to be run. We don't know who put it up. No. Only a kind of fake name exists, and some of it seems reasonable, recommending how the world should be run better, but one of them seems to recommend sort of reducing the population by rather huge proportions, which of course some worry because they think, right, at some point they're going to have to kill 2/3 of the world's population. So that's a very mysterious monument, which many people don't like, and it often gets vandalised, by the way. Yeah. But the New World Order, I mean, the New World Order is a real project. It's traceable. You can find where its origins lie. Many leading politicians, from Obama to Gordon Brown to Tony Blair, have openly advocated creating a new world order. And it's a project that seems to have begun early in the 20th century when Arthur Balfour, who would eventually be one of our prime ministers, wrote a letter to Teddy Roosevelt in America, basically proposing that America and Britain should run the world and basically, you know, police the world with their navies, as the great writer Terry Boardman puts it. And this seems to have been the beginning of the so-called special relationship. But the New World Order then took off in the minds of some quite leading thinkers, people like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell. They were big advocates of New World Order. So this is not a secret. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's real. No. H.G. Wells even wrote a book called The New World Order, and it wasn't fiction. It was a blueprint for how it ought to work. You can read it for free online. It's out there. So this is not a conspiracy theory. I always think it's very strange when people say to me, oh, well, that's just a theory. Well, it isn't. You can trace it. I do recommend the works of Terry Boardman, by the way, and his History of the New World Order, which you can also find online. It is really worth reading. And you realise that this is something very insidious. It's been around for a long time. It may well have begun with good intentions, but seems to have fallen into a control and surveillance vehicle and totalitarianism. But I'm not sure that's what it was intended to be originally, but sadly that is indeed what does seem to have happened. And
it's just really amazing, you know, and we had this really interesting talk about that, and the population being down to 500 million, and knowing our luck, I'm not probably going to be in that 500 million, I can assure you. It's just...
Well, I mean, listen, just because somebody advocates that that's what they want, of course, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to try and bring it about.
Let's hope not.
You know, let's hope they don't. I mean, we do hear, I mean, you have to be a bit careful, because what you don't want to do is fall prey to fear. Fear is used to control us all. That's one of the very tools that the powers that be use. And around the conspiracy world, you often find there's a lot of fear-mongering that actually I don't think is that helpful. And every time you get bird flu or the Ebola virus or something, somebody always says, that's it, it's the end of the world, here's the beginning of depopulation. Well, it so far hasn't been true, and I like to hope that it won't be true. But, we need to be a bit careful. So just because somebody advocates getting rid of 2/3 of the world's population or more, it doesn't necessarily mean they will.
No.
You have to hope they won't. You've got to have an optimism here.
Good. I bloody hope they don't. One of the really fascinating conspiracy theories that I was listening to on your talk was Paul McCartney. Now, I'd heard a little bit about it, but I just not really paid any attention to it. But in your talk, the Conspiracy of the World speech, it seems to be have quite a lot of evidence, actually, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, okay, so the Paul McCartney is dead theory is something that sort of really started to take root, I think, in the early 70s, I believe, on student radio in America. And this rumour went round that, in fact, he had died back in 1966 in a car crash, and that they'd replaced him with a lookalike who was, equally, if not more talented. And, basically the Beatles didn't want their career ruined. The powers that be that were using the Beatles as a kind of psyops experiment didn't want that stopped in its tracks. So they had to kind of pretend that McCartney was still alive. Now, on one level, it sounds utterly ridiculous. Yeah. On the other level, you find there are some strange things about it. I mean, the people that believe that Paul died, they argue that the Beatles basically were trying to tell their listeners what really had happened. They couldn't come out with it officially, but they leave clues in the lyrics. And there's a few lyrics about car crashes and strange little sort of snippets where people seem to say things like, I buried Paul and all of this. There are many people that say that's complete baloney and it's all being misinterpreted. But then you do get things like the strange visual clues in some of their record covers. Paul often seems to be singled out. And it is quite interesting on the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover. If you put a mirror up to the line on the drum kit, which says Sgt. Pepper's Lonely, if you put a mirror there, it gives you the words "one he die" with some Roman numerals, which some say indicate the date where he really died. Now, that kind of thing, you think, oh, that is a big coincidence, isn't it? So some think that whether or not McCartney really died, that there is somebody playing mind games here, if you pardon the Beatles pun there.
Yeah.
That they're messing with people's heads. Now, there are some people, Andrew Johnson is one researcher, absolutely believes McCartney's dead. I mean, I cannot say that, I just don't know. You'd like to hope, wouldn't you, that his family might have noticed something strange going on, but who knows? And, there's all kinds of theories that the new man came in and was programmed with McCartney's memories. I mean, where do you want to go with it? But what I do think is interesting is that even if McCartney didn't really die, it does look as if somebody used the belief that he did to mess with people.
Yeah.
And so it still therefore stands as a kind of a classic psyops type conspiracy theory, whichever way you look at it. And certainly some of the clues do seem very mysteriously coincidental, and that's where some people say it can't be coincidence. So it's worth finding out more about it. And in my conspiracies book, I write about this in the opening section as one of those things where there's so many grey areas, it's almost impossible to get to the bottom of it, but there's something odd occurring there.
For me, that was a revelation, actually, because I just looked at it and thought, this is ridiculous. But after looking to your talk, it actually sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? It really, really does sound odd. And it seems like maybe someone is in their HR department having a laugh and just trying to throw out all these sort of like curveballs. But there seems to be something a bit to it, doesn't there?
I don't think it's just nothing. Whether, as I say, McCartney, the real McCartney, is still with us or not today, I don't think anybody can say. But even if he is, I think there's something mysterious. Somebody tried to seed an idea out there that certainly has, I think, been used to create some trouble somewhere down the line. Yeah,
maybe it's just good PR. And the last one I wanted to speak to you about with crop circles. I know you've got a book on crop circles, haven't you?
I've written a few over the years. I mean, what brought me into the world of conspiracy theory and, looking at all these big political events like the ones we covered today, and at 9/11, there's another big one we didn't talk about today. But what brought me in was investigating what some might call the paranormal, and crop circles certainly drew me into that, and UFO research and all of this. And what I realised was that, and I'm very aware that crop circles are highly controversial to this day, but that whether you believe they were man-made or whether you believe they were coming from some other strange realm, what you could absolutely prove, and I realised this very quickly, was that the media was lying. They were misrepresenting them. They weren't telling the truth about what was going on in the fields, and that hasn't changed to this day. Every few years or so, the press runs stories saying crop circles have all finished. They don't happen anymore. And then you look at the internet and realise there were loads of crop circles that very week. These are the kinds of lies that keep going around. And very early on, I realised, well, if they're lying about something as seemingly harmless as crop circles, what else are they lying about? Yeah. And of course, then in my research, I began to meet other people like Marcus Allen of Nexus magazine, people like Jim Mars, sadly no longer with us, and you meet these people and you talk to them, and you realise that there's a whole other world of just massive misrepresentation, blatant lying. And so before you know it, you started with a pretty pattern in the field that's making you think, and then you've realised that absolutely everything is being warped by the powers that be, and that they're effectively brainwashing the population. They're controlling people to think one way instead of another, and of course the media is somewhere in the middle of it. And the media and the authorities are just two sides of the same coin. Yeah. They might expose each other a bit to a degree, but there's always a line they don't cross. And you have to treat them really as one and the same thing. And although the internet, of course, has made a lot of this alternative information available, we can't rely on that always being there. And at the moment, of course, they're trying to close it all down by calling it fake news. Yeah. Well, fake news is very subjective, isn't it? And the fake news sort of scandal is being used to shut down perfectly legitimate alternative inquiry, and that is a very worrying thing. But I think the authorities have realised the genie got out of the bottle some years ago, and they've been trying to find a good excuse to put it back in. And so now by doing this, and I think they also seed fake stories themselves to deliberately muddle the mix, then of course everybody's left confused, not knowing what to believe. So we need to, again, always therefore be looking for repeated sources and references and actual evidence, not just saying things for which there is no basis at all. Yeah. And that's why, I always try to gather that evidence and try to present it to people in my talks and in my books in a way that is accessible, but also leaves people to effectively weigh up the evidence themselves. But there is evidence for a lot of this stuff, and much of what we've covered today, I would say, is certainly worth a good look.
There's a million things we haven't even got to, and I could spend all day speaking to you about my thoughts and feelings about some of these things, and maybe we try and get you on again if you're up for that.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure, anytime.
Well, so you're in Cardiff. Tell us a little bit about your tour at the moment. So you're in Cardiff soon?
Yeah, there's a network called Funzing, and they're trying to get sort of people in the cities out to talks, and particularly aimed at younger people, which is brilliant, and they're putting on events. So I'm speaking in Cardiff on the 1st of September, the Cardiff Funzing. They're all open to the public. Yeah. And then, I'm doing a little tour for them, and I've got Manchester on the 24th of September, and then Birmingham and Nottingham at the end of October. But if anybody wants to look up the dates and get the links to the pages, if they go to my website, which is truthagenda.org, then go to the upcoming talks page, you can actually see them all listed there. And there's other talks I'm doing around the country. So, if anybody wants to come out and make it along to one of the lectures, that'd be lovely. Yeah. So, do have a look at truthagenda.org.
Brilliant. We're hoping to come down ourselves. We're based in Cardiff, so we're hoping to come down. We'll come and meet you. I'll bring my book, Andy. You can sign it.
Yeah, it'd be great
if I find it. But no, it's been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you so much. You're really excited to speak to you. And I know some of the other guys, generally there's a few of us on the show, they couldn't make it today, but a few of them are really gutted that they couldn't get to speak to you. But maybe on the weekend we will.
Well, maybe so, yeah, sorry about the coughing, but thanks very much for having me on. I do appreciate it.
You're getting so vexed and so into it. That's understandable. I like it. I love the enthusiasm. Okay, guys, just remind you that you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, SoundCloud, iTunes, Twitter, anything else that you can find us on. What else is it?
Instagram.
And Instagram. Sorry, I've just been reminded by the producer we're on Instagram as well. All right then, guys, and thanks very much, and thanks to Andy.